with just the firm words, "She will be under my roof tonight." James silenced the crowd. Despite Edward's insults and the villagers' contemptuous looks, James took Clara's hand, protected her and the baby, and led them out of the church in the pouring rain. The Arizona sun blazed high above Dry Creek, its merciless light glinting against the whitewashed walls of the small frontier church. Inside, the air hung heavy with perfume and sweat candle smoke, drifting in slow, suffocating curls. Every pew was filled, ranchers in patched coats, merchants in polished boots, wives in stiff dresses. They had come not just for a wedding, but for a spectacle, because every union in a small town was as much a bargain as it was a promise. At the altar stood Edward Monroe, a prosperous trader whose watch chain caught every glint of light like a badge of conquest. He wore his suit like a man announcing his victory. His lips tugged into a thin smile that spoke more of triumph than love. For Edward, this marriage was business land dowry and reputation, all tied neatly in the pale figure of the bride beside him, Clara Dawson. Her gown was simple. The lace yellowed from age. She clutched a bouquet of dried flowers, their brittle stems breaking in her hands. Her parents sat stiffly in the front pew, her father stone-faced her mother, biting her lip until it blanched. They had wagered everything on this marriage. Edward's money would erase their debts, and their daughter's shame would be hidden beneath a respectable name. The priest's voice rose solemnly. "Do you, Edward Monroe, take this woman to be your lawful wife?" Edward's reply came smooth and quick. "I do." The priest turned. "And do you, Clara Dawson, take this man?" The words fractured under a piercing cry that rang out from the side chamber. A baby's cry. Every head turned. A young servant girl stumbled forward, pale and trembling, clutching a swaddled infant. The cries echoed through the rafters like a trumpet call of judgment. Whispers erupted. "She has a child. A bastard. Deceit." Clara's bouquet slipped from her hands, scattering petals across the stone floor. Edward's face twisted dark with fury. He ripped the ring from his pocket and hurled it at her feet. "You dare bring me another man's bastard and call it mine?" His voice cracked like a whip. "There will be no wedding. Let all see what kind of woman you are." The crowd surged with murmurs and jeers. Mothers shielded their daughters. Men shook their heads in disgust. Clara's father rose jaw-set and left without a word. Her mother followed, skirts brushing past her as though Clara herself carried a disease. "Wait!" Clara cried, reaching for them. "Please!" But they did not turn. Her knees buckled and she stumbled from the altar, clutching the child against her chest. The voices clawed at her sharp as barbed wire. Liar, deceiver, shame. She collapsed at the church steps, tears blurring her sight, the baby's small cries blending with her own. The congregation's noise swelled a storm of accusation and disdain. Clara bent over the child, rocking him desperately, the only anchor she had left. She whispered through tears, "Hush, my darling, hush. I've got you. That's all I have now." And then silence. It was not mercy, but something heavier. The voices faltered. A shadow stretched across the aisle, long and deliberate. Boots struck the wooden floor with a slow rhythm that silenced even the cruelest whispers. James Carter. He had stood at the back of the church as he always did when he came to town, tall, broad-shouldered, his skin weathered by sun and wind. James was a rancher, known for his solitude, a man of few words who spoke more with his silence than others did with their sermons. People said he preferred cattle to company, that his voice was rarer than rain in the desert. But now, as he moved forward, every eye turned to him. Clara lifted her tear-stained face. Their gazes met her eyes wide with disbelief, his steady and unflinching. He stopped beside her, the murmurs of the crowd pressing close like walls. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice rough as gravel, yet firm as stone, he spoke. "She'll sleep under my roof tonight," gasps rippled through the pews. A few scoffed others muttered, but none dared rise against the finality of his words. James extended his hand, palm scarred and calloused from years of rope and reins. Clara's fingers trembled as she placed them in his. He lifted her with ease, steadying her as though she weighed nothing. The baby stirred, but quieted against her chest, lulled by the steadiness of his presence. Edward sneered from the altar, his pride wounded, his voice dripping contempt. "Take her, Carter. She's ruined goods. You'll drown in her shame." James turned his gaze on him, silent, unyielding. Edward faltered, his bluster shriveling under the weight of those gray eyes. Without another word, James guided Clara down the aisle. His arm came firm around her shoulders, shielding her from the burning stairs, and whispered poison. The church doors swung open, and a rush of storm wind tore through the room, scattering candles and hymn sheets. Together they stepped into the rain. The downpour soaked Clara's gown, plastering fabric to skin, but she clung to the baby, clung to James's steady arm. Behind them, the church echoed with discontent, but ahead lay only the storm and the wide, empty desert. Each step felt like a burial of the life she had known, the father who had abandoned her, the mother who turned away the man who had promised security, but instead cast her into ruin. Yet beside her walked a man who had spoken only a handful of words, but whose silence carried more than any oath she had ever heard. James led her to his horse, a rangy bay, waiting patiently under the pelting rain. With one hand he steadied her as she mounted the other, shielding the baby from the worst of the storm. Then he swung into the saddle behind her, his coat wrapping around them both, as though he were the wall between her and the world. The church bells tolled faintly in the distance as hooves struck mud and carried them away from Dry Creek. Clara pressed her cheek against the coarse wool of James's coat, her child nestled close. She did not know what awaited at the end of this ride shelter, perhaps judgment anew, but for the first time since the altar she felt the faint flicker of something she had thought gone forever. Not safety, not yet, but the fragile, trembling hope that she was no longer alone. The desert swallowed them whole. The rain tapered into a fine mist as James Carter guided his horse across the flats, hooves striking mud that clung to fetlocks. Clara Dawson clutched her child close, every jolt of the ride a reminder of how fragile he was. The storm wind stung her cheeks, but James's coat shielded most of the cold. His silence pressed heavy, yet it did not weigh on her like the silence of her parents or the congregation. This one felt deliberate, steady, almost protective. At last, through the haze, a squat homestead rose, a house of weathered timbers, roof patched with tin fences stretched toward dark silhouettes of cattle pens. It was not the grand estate Edward Monroe had flaunted, nor the polished parlor her parents once dreamed she would inhabit. This was different. It looked built by hands that never stopped mending. James dismounted first, then turned and lifted Clara down with practiced ease, his grip strong but careful. Her legs trembled as they hit the earth. The child stirred in her arms, whimpering. She parted her lips, unsure if to thank him, to apologize, or to beg, but words failed. His silence swallowed hers whole. He pushed the door open. Warmth of smoke and faint leather greeted them. The room was plain, a scarred wooden table near the hearth jars lined neatly on a shelf, a rifle resting in the corner. Boots by the door, a coat hanging on a peg. The home of a man who asked little but labor of life. James took her soaked shawl and hung it to dry. He struck a match, coaxed flame into the hearth shadows leaping across the walls. Without glancing at her, he set a log on the fire, then pulled a folded blanket from a chest and laid it on the bed. Every movement precise, efficient, the rhythm of someone used to mending what others discarded. Clara stood at the doorway, confusion nodding with gratitude. Why would he do this? When the whole town spat on her name, why would this rancher who owed her nothing open his door? She shifted the child, unsure whether to step farther or retreat. James crouched, set a kettle on the fire, and fixed the broken window latch so the wind would not creep in. When the baby whimpered, he glanced over, eyes softening for a heartbeat. He warmed a strip of cloth by the fire and handed it to her without a word. She pressed it to her child, who soon quieted, sinking into sleep. Clara's throat tightened. The silence was not cold. It felt like shelter after a storm. Hours passed. The fire dimmed to embers. Clara sat in the corner, rocking her baby, her heart raw and restless. The baby slept, yet her mind could not. Shame still echoed in her chest, Edward's fury, the congregation's jeers, her parents' backs turned against her. Yet here in this quiet she felt steadier. Not safe, not fully, but steadier. That calm cracked with the sound of boots on dirt. Voices carried across the night. Clara's breath froze. Lantern light flickered against the window's shadows of men gathering outside. "Open up, Carter," a voice barked. "You're hiding her in there." The baby stirred, whimpering. Clara pressed him tight, her hands trembling. Another voice snarled, "That lying woman and her bastard don't belong under your roof. Bring her out. Let the town judge her proper." Fists pounded on the door. The porch groaned under the weight of men. The kettle rattled against the firestones. Clara's heart slammed in her ribs. James rose. His boots struck the floorboards, slow, deliberate. He reached for the Colt at his hip, the movement unhurried, calm. The pounding grew louder. The latch strained. The door shook. Then, crash. The door swung inward. A man lunged forward, hand outstretched for the child. Clara's scream tore the night. She stumbled back, shielding her baby. James moved like lightning. His revolver cleared, leather hammer cocked, muzzle flaring with thunder. A single shot cracked into the night sky through the open doorway, the echo rolling across the flats like judgment. The bullet bit into the roof beam above, wood splintering. Smoke curled in the air. The crowd froze. James leveled his gaze, gray eyes cold as steel. His voice came low, steady, carrying the weight of command. "You touch her, or the child," he said, "and I'll bury you right here." The man who had lunged stumbled back, hands trembling. The others shifted uneasily, muttering curses under their breath, but not daring to step forward. Mothers pulled children away. The weight of James's silence pressed heavier than any sermon, his revolver steady, as if it were part of him. Clara clutched her baby, tears streaming down her face. No one had ever stood between her and the world before, not for gain, not for gold. Only now, in the battered home of a rancher who rarely spoke, had someone raised his hand against her tormentors. The men retreated, grumbling. Lanterns swung as their shadows disappeared into the desert. The door creaked as James shoved it shut. This time, the latch held. Inside, the fire crackled on. Clara stood trembling, her baby against her chest, eyes locked on the man who had claimed nothing, asked nothing, yet given her more than anyone else ever dared. His silence lingered, but it no longer felt empty. It was filled with resolve. That night, sleep came in broken fragments. Clara dozed by the fire, waking at every creak of the house. Each time, James was there, seated in his chair by the window, revolver resting on his thigh. He did not speak, but his presence was steady as the walls around her. The baby slept soothed by the rhythm of safety he had never known. Clara pressed her lips to her child's hair, whispering through tears, "You're safe tonight, my love." Safe. And though she could not yet say why, her heart knew this night marked a turning. From the church steps of shame to this small house of quiet defiance, she had been carried into something fragile but unyielding. For the first time, she felt the weight of protection, and perhaps, in the silent strength of James Carter, the faint beginning of hope. The desert morning came pale and brittle, the light catching on the broken latch James had reforged during the night. Clara Dawson stirred on the rough blanket, her child curled against her chest. For the first time in days, she had slept without the echo of jeers clawing at her dreams. But as her eyes adjusted to the faint glow of dawn, she saw James seated by the window, hat pulled low, his rifle across his knees. He had not slept. He watched the horizon as though expecting more shadows to emerge from the dark. Clara shifted, pressing a kiss to her baby's brow. She wanted to thank him, to say anything, but his silence clamped around the words in her throat. She brewed courage instead. "You didn't have to stand for us," she murmured, her voice breaking. "But you did." James didn't turn. He simply set his rifle aside and poured water into a tin cup, sliding it across the table toward her. His silence was not dismissive. It was steady, like he wanted her to drink to gather strength. Still, she could see tension in the set of his jaw, something unspoken grinding beneath his calm. That night, as the fire sank to embers, her own silence cracked. Dreams spilled her secrets. "No, Daniel, don't." She whimpered in her sleep, thrashing gently, clutching her child. The land, blood everywhere. James sat rigid, his hands tightening on his knees. The name hung in the air, thick as smoke. Daniel. He listened until dawn paled the desert, then rose with the decision pressing in his chest. When Clara awoke, her baby cooing softly beside her, James stood at the table. His broad shoulders squared, his voice even but sharp as flint. "You called a name last night. Daniel." Clara froze. Shame curled in her stomach. "Tell me the truth," he said, low but relentless. The child stirred. She pressed her lips to its head, tears biting her eyes. "Daniel was the man I loved," she whispered. "A cowboy, poor but kind. We dreamed of a ranch, a life carved from dust. He wanted nothing but land he could shape with his own hands." Her voice cracked. "But Edward Monroe wanted it too. When Daniel refused to sell, men came in the night. Guns. They called it a quarrel. But I knew whose coin bought the bullets." James's jaw tightened, muscles straining beneath his stubble. Clara buried her face in her baby's hair. "When my parents learned of the child, they panicked. Debts strangled us. Edward offered marriage money enough to keep them fed. They begged me. 'Think of the family,' they said. So I did. I hid my baby. I stood at that altar, ready to trade my soul for survival. But the child cried, and everything collapsed. Silence pressed the room. Clara wept softly, her secret bared. James turned slowly, setting the tin cup down with a dull thud. His eyes shadowed, his voice gravel rough. "My brother," he said at last. "He wanted land, too. A patch near the river. Men came with papers signed by sheriffs who never touched the soil. When my brother stood against them, they put him in the ground and called it justice." He looked past her, gaze hard on the horizon. The men behind it walked free. Men like Edward Monroe. Clara's heart clenched. Their losses intertwined like threads of the same rope. She wanted to reach for him, but his shoulders braced stiff, his pain locked behind silence. The fragile peace broke at dusk. James had noticed hoof prints earlier, faint tracks across the dry earth, but had kept quiet. Now, as Clara fed the baby by the hearth, the crack of a rifle shattered the window. Glass exploded across the floor. Down, James barked, pulling Clara and the baby to the ground as another bullet slammed into the wall. Voices roared outside. "Come out," Carter hand over the woman, "and maybe we'll let you breathe another day." Clara's pulse surged, fear suffocating her. Edward's men. He hadn't finished with her yet. James snatched up his rifle and kicked the door wide. Gunfire burst in the night. He moved with deadly precision, each shot measured, each step deliberate. A man screamed and fell into the dust. Another bolted behind a trough. James fired again, the report echoing across the flats. The barn shook under flying lead. Inside, Clara crouched with her baby, whispering frantic prayers. Her arms ached from clutching the child, but she dared not loosen her hold. Then the door crashed inward. A wild-eyed man lunged with a knife, flashing his gaze locked on the cradle. Clara screamed, throwing herself in front of her child. James was faster. He hurled himself across the room, yanking the baby into his chest. The knife slashed tearing leather from his vest, but sparing flesh. James twisted revolver, bucking twice. The intruder collapsed, knife clattering across the floorboards. Smoke stung the air. The house fell eerily silent, gunfire outside fading into scattered curses. The attackers wavered, unnerved by the man who had cut them down with such calm brutality. James knelt in the firelight, the child pressed tight to his chest. His broad back heaved, gray eyes softening as he looked down at the tiny face. His voice came low, rough, but steady. "It's all right. You're safe now." Clara froze, tears streaming down her cheeks. For the first time, she saw more than the silent rancher. She saw a man, scarred by grief, carrying death on his hip, yet cradling her child as though it were sacred. The attackers melted into the desert, their courage spent. James did not pursue. He only rocked the infant gently until its cries dulled into whimpers, then returned it to Clara's arms, his hand lingering a moment longer than needed. "You risked your life for us," she whispered. James gave no answer. He holstered his revolver, silence heavier than words. Later, after the dead were dragged beyond the fence and the house patched as best it could be, the fire burned low. Clara lay restless on the bed, her baby asleep beside her. From the corner of her eye, she saw James by the hearth, rocking the child again when it stirred his scarred hands, surprisingly gentle. A low whistle slipped from his lips, halting and rough but steady. The baby stilled, sinking back into slumber. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth, her chest trembling. She had never seen tenderness from a man so deeply carved by solitude, and as she watched him, framed by the flicker of firelight, she realized the truth that struck harder than bullets. James Carter was not only shielding her from a town that hated her. He was fighting something within himself, choosing to protect not from duty, but from something far more dangerous, the stirrings of care. And for Clara, who had known only abandonment, it was the most frightening, fragile hope of all. Days bled into one another at the Carter Ranch, the desert sun rising and falling over routines that slowly knitted a fragile rhythm into Clara's life. The house smelled of smoke and leather, of dust, shaken from boots and hay clinging to clothes. James Carter spoke little, but his actions filled the silence like words Clara had longed to hear. Each morning he was gone before dawn, dust clinging to his boots when he returned from the corral. Sometimes he left a pail of goat's milk on the table with a quiet nod toward her child. Other times, she discovered her torn dress mended with uneven stitches, thread pulled too tight in some places, loose in others. His hands were made for reins and rifles, not needles, yet the effort left Clara breathless with gratitude. One evening, as the baby's cries frayed her exhausted body, Clara sank onto the bed, rocking helplessly. The child wailed louder, small fists balled tight. She felt her arms give way. Then James filled the doorway. Without a word, he reached for the child. His scarred hands, more used to rope and rifle, cradled the infant with surprising gentleness. He hummed, low, steady, halting, but true, a ranch tune born under endless skies. Slowly, the child stilled, breathing soft against his chest. Clara watched from the bed, her eyes burning. For the first time since the church steps, hope tugged at her chest, dangerous in its tenderness. But the world outside had not forgotten. One evening, the fire glowed low as the desert wind rattled shutters. The sound of hooves broke the quiet. James rose, brushing his palm across the revolver at his hip. From the horizon emerged a lean figure, scar across his jaw, riding with the ease of a man who'd lived too long in the saddle. Jed Carver. Once he and James had ridden the borderlands together, fighting raiders, hunting outlaws, sharing whiskey under the stars. James had dragged him, bleeding from a canyon no sane man would have entered. Now, Jed dismounted his boots, crunching dirt as he stepped toward the fire. "Been a long time," Carter Jed drawled, dropping heavily onto a log. Flames lit his grin. James stayed standing, silent, eyes steady. Jed tipped his head toward Clara, who stood frozen with her baby pressed close. "Heard stories about you hauling a woman and her bastard out of Dry Creek, like some knight from a dime novel. Didn't believe it till now." His laugh was low and mocking. Clara stiffened, her heart slamming. She held the baby tighter, but James's steady glance told her to stay calm. Jed leaned forward. "Word is Edward Monroe put a bounty on her head, rich enough to draw hunters from Tucson clear to Santa Fe. We could split it, James. One last ride. You hand her over, we take the gold, and you'll never mend another fence post in your life. Enough to buy a herd, big enough to blot out the horizon." The fire cracked. The desert hushed. Clara's breath hitched. The words cut sharp. She looked to James, dreading his answer. He lowered his eyes to the tin cup in his hand, set it carefully on the dirt. The weight of that sound felt heavier than a gunshot. His fingers brushed the grip of his revolver, but did not draw. When he lifted his gaze, his voice was quiet but hard as iron. "I don't trade people. Not her, not the child. That ain't my kind of gold." Jed's grin faltered. For a moment he searched James's face for hesitation. All he found was unshakable calm. "You always were a fool," Jed muttered, brushing dust from his coat as he rose. "One day, that kind of thinking will get you killed." He mounted the sound of hooves fading back into the desert. Clara's legs weakened beneath her. She sat by the hearth, clutching her baby. Tears blurred her sight. Why she whispered, her voice trembling. "You could have had everything. Gold, land, safety." James stared into the fire, his jaw tight. When he spoke, his words were simple, but they fell like stone. "Because some things ain't for sale. Not life, not dignity." Clara's tears spilled freely. She looked at him, the man who had carried her from the church steps, who had shielded her child with his own body, and who now turned away from fortune itself rather than see her broken. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of a man's choice not measured in coin, but in conviction. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, her baby breathing softly beside her, the fire painting James's face in shadow and gold. He sat with his back against the wall hat, pulled low revolver within reach. but his eyes lingered not on the gun nor on the door, but on the cradle he had carved with his own hands. Clara pressed her hand over her mouth, her chest trembling. Amid blood and terror, something fragile had taken root. She could not yet name it, but it was stronger than the fear, stronger than the shame. When dawn broke, the desert stretched wide and pale-washed clean of night. Clara rose gathering water, scrubbing a shirt with trembling hands. She wanted to show she was not only a burden. By the time James returned from the corral, the table held bread and beans. "You should sit," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the dishes and her pale face. "I wanted to help," she whispered. He didn't argue. Instead, he placed a folded scrap of paper by her bowl. She glanced down, reading the words scrawled in rough strokes, "Rest. The fence can wait." Her throat tightened. He could have ordered her to bed. Instead, he gave her dignity. As days passed, Clara began to see James's silence differently. It was not emptiness, it was a language. Each act milk for the baby stitches, for her dress, a wordless note left on the table spoke more than oaths or vows. One evening, as the fire burned low, she found herself seated beside him. Her voice trembled but steadied as she said, "I was left at the church steps with nothing but shame. But you gave me a home." James paused, the cloth stilling in his hand as he cleaned his saddle. For a long moment, he did not look at her. Then he set the saddle aside, rough fingers brushing lightly across hers. His voice came low, steady. "Home ain't walls, Clara. It's who you share the fire with." Her throat tightened. She turned her hand, catching his, holding it in the glow of the firelight. For the first time, she believed the word home belonged to her. The desert night lay heavy outside, but inside the small ranch house something stronger than silence filled the air. Something neither Edward Monroe's gold nor the town's scorn could strip away. Something that felt dangerously close to love. Wind shouldered the walls of the little ranch house until the shutters rattled like teeth. By dusk, clouds stacked black on the horizon and the air tasted of iron. James Carter cinched his saddle straps tight, the leather creaking under his hands, and glanced once at Clara Dawson as she swaddled the baby against her chest. "He won't stop," James said, voice low. "Not while folks in town believe his lies." Clara nodded, her jaw set. "Then we won't hide." They rode in under a sky split by lightning. Rain hammered the hard-packed street of Dry Creek, turned alleys into sluices, and raised the smell of mud and horsetail. Lanterns bobbed through the swell of people pushing into the church, its whitewashed siding streaked gray in the storm. Inside, the pews heaved with bodies, merchants shaking rain from hats, ranch hands crowding shoulder to shoulder, women clutching shawls close. At the front stood Edward Monroe Coate, dark with water voice sharp enough to cut the room. "She deceived you all," he declared, pointing toward the door as if summoning a ghost. "A woman who brought another man's bastard to my altar, and the drifter who snatched her away to steal what's mine. They're thieves of name of land of decency." Murmurs rose like another weather front. Some nodded wary and weak. Others stared at the floor. A few young and eager hovered near their gun belts as if truth could be shot into shape. The doors banged wide. Thunder cracked. Clara stepped over the threshold, rain glittering off her lashes, child in her arms. James came beside her, hat brim spilling, water boots echoing on the boards. The babble died to a hard silence. There, Edward spat, eyes bright and mean. The traitor himself, dragging shame back into God's house. James didn't waste a word. He walked 20 paces up the center aisle and stopped where the lamplight cut across the nave. "You left her on these steps," he said, voice steady enough to still the storm. "I picked her up. Not for money, not for land, because no mother and child should be left to the dust. The sentence struck like a bell. Heads lifted. Someone near the back swallowed a curse unsaid. The woman who ran the bakery pressed a hand to her apron, eyes wet. Edward's lips peeled back. "Save your sermons. You think these people don't know you, a killer playing righteous? She would have died in a cell if justice were honest." His hand flashed, metal glinted. He dragged a revolver up and leveled it at Clara. James moved. He shoved Clara and the baby behind the pulpit and spun drawing. Edward fired first. The muzzle blossom battered the thunder, and the bullet ripped James's side, tearing cloth and skin. He barely staggered. His shot cracked an instant later, aimed not at Edward, but at the beam above him. Oak burst splinters rained, and the shock knocked Edward backward, his gun skittering down the center aisle. He crashed to his knees, pale drenched, suddenly small. The church held its breath. You could hear rain drum the roof and the tiny hitch of the child's cry. James lowered his weapon, blood seeping down his shirt. His voice rang iron. "If any man here still believes Edward Monroe, stand by him. But if you've got eyes, you saw the man he is." Silence quivered, and then shifted. A rancher who had traded with Clara's late sweetheart took one step, then two, placing himself between Clara and Edward. The seamstress followed her thin shoulders squared. The baker moved to Clara's other side and lay a shaking hand on the baby's blanket. One by one, like fence posts driven into hardpan townsfolk crossed the aisle until a thin human wall stood facing the merchant who had bought the sheriff's ear and tried to buy the town's conscience. Edward scrambled to his feet, soaked hair plastered to his forehead. "You fools," he hissed. "You will regret this." But no one lifted a hand in his defense. No mouth spoke his name with respect. He stumbled for the door, tripping over the warped threshold, and vanished into the rain, his threats trailing thin as smoke. The wind drove against the church one last time as if to test the hinges, then faltered. The storm outside began to slacken. Inside, candles steadied. Clara leaned around the pulpit, eyes locked on James, where he stood so straight you might not notice the blood. She crossed the space in 3 strides, wordless, pressed the baby close with one arm, and reached for him with the other. He caught her hand, big, rough-braced, and the grip anchored them both. By morning, Dry Creek bore the scrubbed look of a town that wished to forget itself. Street ruts brimmed with clean water. The air smelled of wet cedar. Word about the church, about the gun that fired high, not to kill but to spare, traveled faster than gossip ever had. By the 3rd day, a boy who'd once thrown stones at Clara's shadow stepped off the boardwalk to let her pass. By the 5th, a widow who had muttered shame pressed a loaf into her hands and found she could finally meet Clara's eyes. James did not wait for the town to learn its lesson. He sold off 20 head of cattle and bought rough-cut timber nails by the pound and a pane of glass that caught morning light like water. He built a room on the east side of the house, measuring twice, cutting, once cussing, only when he thought no one could hear. He carved a cradle out of cottonwood edges, sanded smooth joints, pegged tight. The thing came out uneven, stubborn as the man who made it, and perfect in Clara's eyes. When the wind laid down and the nights warmed, he showed her how to sit a saddle without fear. His palm steadied her waist the first time the mare tossed her head. "Lean with her," he said, and for once he added the smallest ghost of a smile. The baby gurgled from the porch with the sun in his hair, and Clara laughed a round sound she hadn't heard from her own throat since the world upended at the altar. Often, James kept long watch by the fire after mother and child had drifted to sleep, feeding coals, listening to the small sounds of a house that finally felt occupied. Sometimes, when the baby stirred, he took the tiny bundle without fanfare and walked slow circles humming a low, tuneless line of Prairie Night. Clara would wake to find them like that the roughest hands she knew, cupping the gentlest weight on earth. Days lengthened. The desert put on a green no one expects from a place so hard. One dawn, he stepped onto the new porch with the baby cradled in the crook of one arm. Clara stood beside him, shawl pulled close, though the air was mild. The sun, shouldered up from the low hills, spilled gold across the pasture and cast their shadows long and even. 3 figures where once there had been a single silhouette and a sorrow. Clara turned her hand into James's. His fingers closed sure. The baby reached toward the light with a fist no bigger than a walnut, and the 2 adults let out the breath neither realized they had been saving since the day the church doors had blown wide. They did not speak vows. They did not need to. Everything that mattered was already happening board by board, choice by choice, the fence mended before it sagged, the fire fed before it failed, the cradle rocked before a cry could bloom. And Dry Creek, which had proven itself cruel, and then at last teachable, learned to nod when Clara passed to tip a hat toward James without flinching at his silence and to look just a little longer at the face of a child who had turned a whole town around. If you carry anything from Clara and James's story, let it be this: dignity is not something other people can grant or take away. It's something you choose to stand for, especially when no one is watching. Kindness isn't noisy. It looks like a door opened in a storm, a cradle carved by clumsy hands, a shot fired high when anger says aim low. In a world that tries to price everything reputation land, even love, there are truths that aren't for sale: the worth of a mother, the safety of a child, the quiet courage of a person who refuses to trade another human being for comfort. We don't all face a church full of doubters, but we all face moments when it's easier to look away. Don't. Be the shelter. Be the hand held out. And if this story stirred something in you, drop a comment with your thoughts, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more true-hearted frontier tales where grit meets grace under the wide American sky.